Welcome back, everyone, to the hottest and latest Google Slides live stream coming out of Santa Cruz County, California. Uh, Here is something that I get asked a lot, and that is, well, what is the greatest generation? Everybody's always asking me, hey, there are a lot of generations, what's the greatest generation? Well, and what I always tell them is that the greatest generation is spontaneous generation. Well, what on earth is that? Spontaneous generation is this kind of thing where animals just appear out of non-living matter. Spontaneous generation is not invented by Aristotle, but he definitely formalizes it as a systematic way for animals to reproduce in his book on the generation of animals, which is all about how animals make more animals, something in which Aristotle was deeply, not to say perversely, interested. Um, Aristotle says, well, some animals reproduce sexually. You get a couple of them together, they make more animals like themselves. Um, but some animals don't reproduce that way. Some animals do not reproduce sexually, but instead come into being from dead matter, from stuff that is not alive. And that second thing, where animals just come into existence from dead stuff, that's spontaneous generation. Now, you might say that's not really part of my experience of how animals generate, and I'm sure that's fine, but it does solve some real brain teasers, some real intellectual problems. The one to which Aristotle mostly applies it is this: how do you explain animals coming into existence when you can't see their eggs, or you can't see what they hatch out of? So for small animals like fleas, for instance, for certain kinds of flies which appear as maggots, for instance, in rotting meat or something like that, you can't really see their eggs without a microscope. This is the thing of fleas. It takes a long time before anyone's actually able to spot flea eggs. So, given that you can't actually see the eggs that these animals hatch out of, you've got to explain how they come into existence somehow, and they do seem to appear kind of just spontaneously on the skin of dogs, the skin of cats, what have you. So, an intellectually responsible thing to do might simply be to say, well, fleas spontaneously generate. They are the result of spontaneous generation. They just develop from the non-living matter on the skin of cats or dogs. Or flies spontaneously generate from uh, cow pies or rotting meat or anything like that. Uh, so for things with very small eggs, very small animals, spontaneous generation is a way of getting around the fact that you can't see their eggs. Uh, there are other animals whose life cycles are really confusing, uh, like eels, for instance. Eels are kind of the classic case of something that is like macroscopic, but was for a long time thought to generate spontaneously because uh, it's really tricky to figure out how their life cycle works. Eels kind of do the reverse thing of salmon. You know how salmon go upriver to breed and they live in the ocean mostly. Eels do the reverse. They live mostly in freshwater and they go into the ocean to breed and reproduce and lay eggs. But the various stages of their life cycle basically look like different animals. Um, they change color, they change shape a lot, and moreover, eel gonads are really hard to find. Um, Lots of people have kind of ruined their eyesight looking for eel gonads. Among them, Sigmund Freud, actually. Freud started his career as a biological investigator, gave up on finding eel testicles, and moved on instead to psychoanalysis. So animals like the eel are another case where spontaneous generation seems to solve an intellectual problem. How do these things reproduce? Um, there's another kind of problem that spontaneous generation solves which is, where does life come from in the first place? Where does life get started? Lucretius, the Epicurean poet philosopher, writing in Rome, 1st century BCE, says, well, Earth gets started life gets started via spontaneous generation. Things just kind of hatch out of the Earth. And Lucretius says, well, that's why we call it Mother Earth, because it is actually the mother of all the stuff that existed, which spontaneously generates out of the ground. So on Lucretius's view, anything was at one point in time able to be spontaneously generated. That's not just fleas and flies and eels, but cats, dogs, people, all that stuff. At one point in time was spontaneously generated from the earth. And Lucretius says, well, the earth has gotten worse, has gotten more feeble since then, so it can't spontaneously generate as many things anymore. Although it can still generate, say, mice, toads, flies, that kind of thing. For Lucretius, the fact that the Earth can still spontaneously generate life shows that it was able to spontaneously generate all life at some point in the past, and that explains where life comes from. So, importantly for Lucretius, you don't need to imagine like a god creating things or anything like that. This debate about whether spontaneous generation can happen or not continues into the early modern period, into the 18th to 19th century. If you were paying particularly close attention in high school biology class, you might remember this experiment carried out by Pasteur, where he boiled some broth at a really high temperature, boiled it in a flask with a long curved neck, the curved neck being such as to catch and trap any kind of stuff coming in from the outside. And this procedure turned out to sterilize the broth, prevent little critters from growing in it. But then if you were to break the stem off, suddenly you would get all these critters. So this experiment is kind of the classic, spontaneous generation doesn't really happen experiment. It's in all the science textbooks as the thing that proves that spontaneous generation didn't happen. Kind of the interesting context there is that Pasteur sees this experiment actually as a refutation of atheism, because it shows that life can't just come into being from dead matter. So that proves that God must have created it. This experiment that Pasteur conducts is kind of a theologically important experiment. And the people on the other side of the debate, people who thought that spontaneous generation could happen, who were sticking by that theory in the 19th century when it had been disproven for most animals, even the fleas and the eels and all that. Not the eels yet, that would have to wait till the 20th century. The people who were still on side with spontaneous generation at that point were generally atheists. People who wanted to prove that life could come to be just from dead matter. You didn't need to involve God there. So, modern science actually, surprisingly, does still believe in at least one incident of spontaneous generation, right? The theory of abiogenesis, where life comes to be from non-living matter, is still widely held among scientists, among biologists who are working very hard, actually doing a lot of interesting work here at UCSC to figure out how that could work chemically, how it was possible at one point to develop life out of non-life. And we are making headway, but that's a reminder that the theory of spontaneous generation, as silly as it seems to us by and large now, is still kind of critical to the scientific understanding of the world. How can we explain the world without recourse to gods and other kinds of mythologies? Well, so there's yet a third problem that spontaneous generation helps solve, and that's a practical one. What happens if all of your bees die? Well, thanks to spontaneous generation, you can do this thing called boogonia, where you just murder a cow, and then a bunch of bees spontaneously generate inside of it. Uh, Most famously, this is described in Virgil's Georgics, but he probably didn't just invent it. It does show up in other sources too. And it's not just bees that you can get this way. You can spontaneously generate lots of different things from lots of different animals. For instance, as Pliny the Elder says in his Natural History, you can get wasps and hornets from a horse. If you really need some wasps and hornets, that's how you do it. And if you need beetles, scarabaei, if you need scarab beetles, you get those from a donkey or an ass. Uh, Not really things that people were probably testing very often, but yeah, so different animals spontaneously generate different things. One of the things that spontaneous generation is this kind of miraculous transformation of one body into another. A body dies, and it produces a whole bunch of living bodies out of it. Well, so that raises the question, what kind of bodies spontaneously generate out of a human being? We don't get any of the cool bugs. The general belief is that from human beings spontaneously generate lizards, worms, snakes. So, surprisingly persistent belief through the Renaissance, even, that when human beings die, snakes spontaneously generate out of their backbone. So you can find a lot of kind of attestations of this through the medieval period and the Renaissance. When we die, we spontaneously generate all sorts of gross stuff, not cool and useful bugs like bees, but just nasty grubs and lizards that want to eat our eyeballs and such. Um, so this spontaneous generation of gross stuff out of human bodies is a really important part of the medieval kind of memento mori tradition. The slide that you're looking at here is from a Middle English text called The Debate Between the Body and the Worms. So the corpse there is imagined as arguing with the various worms that are being generated out of it. And eventually the corpse is just like, well, I guess I'm going to get eaten by worms. Better wait for the last judgment and resurrection so I can have a worm-free body again. Um, and one of the arguments the worms use is, well, we spontaneously generate out of your body. There's absolutely no way you can keep us from generating. Whatever it is that causes us to generate out of your body was born in you. It's a kind of a seed that is born with you and that just kind of activates when you die, so you're stuck with it. So, uh, anyway, depending on how you read it, that's either very grim or, a sign of hope, because there is this kind of circle of life. Our hearts will go on after we pass away. In the form of lizards and nasty snakes and other such things. And that's about all I have to say about spontaneous generation. Um, just a little topical discussion given this horrible coronavirus that is going around. Try not to spontaneously generate any coronavirus inside of yourself. Um, Other than that, have a great night, and I'll be back to talk to you again about something equally gross next week.